Ich habe Deutsch bei der Arbeit gelernt, durch tausende peinliche Momente. Wirklich, da musste ich meinen ganzen Stolz runterschlucken und würde schnell wieder auf den Teppich geholt. Und genau deshalb ist das Thema Deutsch lernen und die deutsche Sprache für mich bis heute immer noch so emotional. It took me seemingly forever to learn to speak German properly. There were many things that I struggled with, but when it comes to actually speaking the language properly, the real hurdle is probably not what you're thinking of. So most people agonize over the grammar and the cases and the pronunciation and knowing how to combine the correct gender with the correct case, which is difficult, like it really is, but it's also learnable. There are strict rules that you can apply. And although it might seem impossible at first, there will be a time when this just kind of like becomes natural. And so I like to think of learning German both as a science and an art. So the science of the language is obviously the structure and the grammar and the word order and the cases and all that kind of good stuff. And there are systems and processes which have been developed for years in the classroom aimed at getting this right and efficient and effective. But for me, the science of learning the language, although it is difficult, like that was never the real barrier. For me, and I think for many other people as well, the real difficulty is that learning German often requires a different relationship with communication, with identity and social interaction, or what I like to call the art of learning German. And this is what life, not the classroom, but what like real daily life confronts you with. So the hardest part is not memorizing the language, but adjusting to the logic that sits underneath it. Because German requires precision in a way that English does not. What is considered polite and empathetic in English is often perceived as insecurity or evasiveness, or sometimes just like lying in German. So if you apply English social ambiguity to German, you are going to create a lot of confusion. And I think it took leaving the country for me to fully appreciate the complexity of the social aspect of communication in English. English really relies very heavily on implication and emotional decoding. So in fact, for an outsider, it can often appear that there is a certain amount of like mind reading going on in English because of having to read between the lines. And, there's a lot of responsibility placed on the listener to decode what is actually meant. And learning any foreign language can affect your personality and how you show up in the world. So this is not necessarily specific to learning German, but you will no doubt probably feel less intelligent at first, for sure. And this can be pretty brutal. Like if your identity is built around being the funny one, then learning a different language can be really tough. In English, you might be quick-witted or sarcastic or socially smooth. And in German, you are then suddenly slow, cautious, and insecure. So, a lot of people, they don't really realize how much of their personality was built on linguistic confidence until you actually lose access to it. It's just that a lot of wit and humor in English, it doesn't translate well into German because it just relies so heavily on wordplay or cultural references, which just do not carry over. And the funny thing is that the German sense of humor, at least in my experience, it's not actually that different to the British sense of humor. So Germans do also use a lot of sarcasm and irony. It just doesn't translate into English. So you have to be able to speak German pretty well to actually understand it, and vice versa. Like it just doesn't translate. What I mean by this, if you watch a British comedy show with German subtitles, I think you'll understand what I'm trying to get at. So learning German, and by extent most foreign languages, it's really less of a technical struggle than it is a psychological one. And so people are often confronted with a loss of confidence and, this inability to express nuance. And this is why so many people from the Anglosphere, they get very offended by Germans. And so if you listen to the stories that people tell about their social interactions, like how the cashier was rude or how the sales assistant didn't want to sell them something, or like that the bus driver started shouting angrily when you tried to talk about tickets or something. It very often does come down to this basic misunderstanding of how the languages are structured and what is valued in each culture. Although, I mean, of course, there are still the aggressive cyclists here and the Beamter, die null Bock haben. Of course, I'm generalizing. Actually, in all honesty, to be fair, I had to get my Aufenthaltstitel renewed recently, and it was actually a barrel of laughs. So the guy who was dealing with my application was literally the spitting image of Fridolin in Zweigstelle. Even had the hair. It was pretty crazy. Which, spoiler alert, if you haven't seen it, Zweigstelle kind of takes the piss, or at least makes light-hearted fun of German bureaucracy and Beamterkultur. And so the guy who was dealing with my application, he wasn't sure how to pronounce the word receipt. And he asked me how to say it because he obviously saw from my application that I was from the UK. But he kept saying Rezept and then Rezept. And then some of his colleagues chimed in the back. They were sitting behind him at their desks, and they sort of chimed in. And then we had a mini discussion about language differences and cultural differences, which was actually quite a lot of fun. So these are aspects of the language that are quite difficult to learn from the textbook or in the classroom, because they do require a certain amount of exposure to real life. And so if you don't have that, then the next best thing is LingoPie, who are kindly sponsoring this video. LingoPie offers a massive selection of shows and films with the ability to make use of incredible language learning tools. You can turn on German or English or both at the same time. Whenever you hit a word you don't understand, you just click it, there's an instant translation, and it's saved to your vocab list and flashcard deck, so you can review it later for further study. What I like most about LingoPie is its flexibility. You can slow down the audio when needed. You can follow along with the full transcript on the side. And if there's a sentence that's tricky, you can just loop it until it clicks. LingoPie has over 3,000 native shows and movies, but not only that, you can make use of these language learning tools by watching your favorite shows on Netflix with their Netflix Chrome extension. If that's not enough for you, you can learn the language with music and books as well. And reading simple children's books is actually how I first started building up my vocabulary. And look, you can just hover over a word, you get an immediate English translation, and it's saved to your vocab list for further study. There are also games features that test what you've just learned while making the language learning journey fun and easy. Oh, and just in case German isn't enough for you, they also offer over 15 other languages, including French, Spanish, Japanese, Korean, Portuguese, Italian, as well as Polish, Hebrew, and Greek. So click the link in the description down below to start your 7-day free trial today. My link also gets you an exclusive discount once inside. If you're lucky enough, Germans will correct your mistakes, and I genuinely mean that. It might feel direct in the moment, and, it is often where people get offended, but it's also one of the fastest ways to improve. And I would say that was instrumental in my own language learning journey, as my colleagues had no problem correcting me or telling me that I was not making any sense when I first started to try and speak German. So, the alternative is that they will just simply switch to English, and while they're usually just trying to be helpful, it can make learning German much, much harder. If you move to a large international city like Berlin or Munich or Hamburg or Frankfurt or something like that, this happens all the time. As soon as people hear that you're not a native speaker, they will instinctively switch to English. And for tourists, this is kind of exactly what you want. It is actually very helpful. But if you've moved here and you're generally trying to build a life in Germany, it can be incredibly frustrating. I really remember how much it annoyed me when I first arrived, because I'd spend hours trying to learn new vocabulary and practicing conversations and sentences. And then I would actually go out to the shops or to the market stand just to try and practice a word or a phrase. And, just to have someone to answer me in English, it was really quite annoying. Today, I really don't mind because I can just switch between the two languages without thinking about it. But when you are at the beginning of your language learning journey, you have to be really persistent and resilient. Sometimes you just have to smile and just like keep responding in German and pretend that you don't speak English. Just be hartnäckig, as they say. Because if you don't, it's very easy to drift into an English-speaking life. You know, 1 year becomes 5, 5 becomes 10, and before you know it, you've built a life in Germany without ever becoming comfortable in the language. And personally, I think that's a real shame because so much of life here only really opens up once you can actually speak German fluently with confidence. I think one thing that many people do not fully appreciate is that there are dozens and dozens of German dialects. So many people speak Hochdeutsch. So what you learn in the classroom, they speak that at work. But when they go home, they speak their own regional dialect with their family. And, it's not just like a different accent. It is very often almost like a different language. So this can be really frustrating, at least it was for me, because in my first few years here, I really started to make progress with German. And I thought, wow, I'm actually starting to understand a lot and be able to express myself properly. But then I would spend Christmas with my ex's family in Baden-Württemberg near Schwäbisch Gmünd. And it was just like literally another foreign language. Like they really struggled to speak Hochdeutsch. They couldn't really speak, proper German. And so it was just like I had to go back to hand signals and facial expressions again. I live now in the German state of Hessen, and my partner's mother is a local through and through. And so she also cannot really speak Hochdeutsch. And so I've had to try and learn some Hessisch as well. And so you can spend years learning textbook German and then you arrive in like a local pub in Frankfurt and suddenly it's like an entirely new, the language has completely changed. It's an entirely new language. And obviously if you're in Bavaria, the language is again incredibly different, like different words and sentence structure. And so, it's like, there's pros and cons to all of this. It can be very frustrating. I don't want to gloss over that. But I'm sure that even for Germans themselves, maybe, if there are any Germans here in the comments, like when you've moved to a different city, especially if like to a smaller town, it does take some getting used to. And, there are still times when I'm just like, what? Like, do we really have to learn another dialect? Can I not just stick with German, please? Come on. But it is also this richness and this density in regional diversity that makes it so interesting to live here. Like, recently I watched the Lucas Podolsky documentary on Netflix, and I found it really interesting, the way that he speaks. And seriously interesting, not in the British sense of the word. My colleagues asked me if I could understand what he was saying, and I could. I really could. I could understand, I would say 95% of what he said, but I could also notice that he had a different accent. Kind of, I don't know, maybe you'd call this accent special. It's definitely something that I had not really heard before. It's not really a Cologne accent. It's not really Polish. I don't know, some kind of mixture. I'm not sure. Maybe it is a Cologne accent. Maybe it is a Cologne accent. I'm not sure. If there are any Germans watching, what would you say? Basically, like most people think learning German is hard because it's grammatically complex. But the grammar is finite, you have to learn it, and you come to a point where you've kind of learned it with the right systems and structure and time. The deeper challenge is adapting to different communication logic, to different social rhythms, and learning what different cultures value. And so at some point, learning German really stops being about translating words and starts becoming a process of adjusting how you think and communicate and relate to other people. And this is the most challenging, but also the most rewarding part of learning a foreign language. And honestly, I really think the world would be a better place if more people learned to communicate in a language and culture that they did not inherit. Like, if not for the fact that it just makes you appreciate your own language and communication and connection that much more. If you've made it this far, you might be interested to know that I am starting a new channel exclusively in German auf Deutsch. So if you want to hear some of my trials and tribulations auf Deutsch, then I will include the link to the new channel below in the description box. You can check that out. It should be live by the time you watch this, but if not, just click subscribe and you should be notified when the videos go live. Thanks so much for watching. If you found this helpful or interesting, please do let me know in the comments. Give it a like. Until next time, ade. Tschüss.